Dr. Natalie Underberg Good is a UCF professor with a passion for folklore and digital media. Today we will talk about what these two have in common and how she incorporates them in her work to create a lasting legacy. Tell me about yourself and your research work.
So I'm a folklorist by training. So I went to college in Northern California studying social cultural anthropology, and then I went to graduate school in Indiana studying folklore and ethnomusicology. So that's actually what my doctorate is in. But my specialization within that is narrative. So anything to do with storytelling, and increasingly in my work I'm interested in design and digital design and how people can work in collaborative ways to create digital projects. So a lot of the work that I do tries to sort of break down the barriers between, technical experts on the one hand, cultural experts on the other, and the tradition bearers, right, whose traditions we're trying to document and share. So I want to kind of break open that black box of how these digital projects get made, and bring people further into the design process, right? And the decision process about how the projects are designed, what they look like, and how they're received.
How do you define folklore?
So folklore can have a number of definitions, kind of like culture. There's a whole book that's definitions of culture, but I like to think of folklore as artistic expression in small groups, or artistic communication in small groups. Another way to look at it is it's a form of shared culture, typically between groups that have some factor in common. And there's an element often of informal transmission. So you might learn it from someone else. You might apprentice yourself to someone who is a master artist and maybe learn how to do that particular folklore form. So when I explain what folklore is, I often think of a couple of things. One is I describe it in terms of genres, right? So there are kinds of folklore. There are verbal or oral forms of folklore, like legends and myths. There are material kinds of folklore, like the arpietas I was talking about earlier, these three-dimensional story cloths. And there are customary types of folklore, so things like festivals, right, or folk drama. That's all folklore. And what makes it kind of characteristic is that it's unstandardized, right? So every performance of it is both a thing and it's a process, right? So it draws upon tradition and the way that others have created it, but then the individual also performs it anew each time. And so it's always evolving and it's always changing.
What are ways digital media facilitates the preservation and dissemination of folklore?
So in the work that I do, what I really focus on is how the particular characteristics of digital media can be used to show people, like I explained before, how folklore is both like an artifact and a process, right? So I'll give you the example of a project that I worked on in Cusco, Peru, with the Center for Traditional Textiles and a group of women weavers there. It's a nonprofit. So they make weavings and they sell weavings. So they both preserve the heritage and interact with tourists and global economic flows. So my question as a folklorist is, how can I kind of build a context around this piece of folklore? So I'm trying to explain to you what this weaving means. I can use the interactive and the immersive potential of digital media in order to allow you to kind of engage with that object, right? Ask questions about it, see it from different angles, maybe surround it with stories that help to explain what it means. Or we could simulate, perhaps through an interactive narrative, the experience of being a tourist and making a choice about whether to buy that textile. And that all kind of comes back to this earlier issue I talked about trying to create collaborative ways of designing digital media. So the first question I ask before we do anything is, what are you trying to communicate? What are some of the key cultural ideas you're trying to communicate or concerns you want people to know about? So the weavers, for example, that I spoke with had a concern that people would not know why their weavings cost more money right, than weavings that one might find at a typical open air market. Well, they needed to know about things like what is a nonprofit group, what is fair trade, right? What does it make? What does it take to create a weaving of that complexity, right? So part of the job of the digital project was to use interactive storytelling, digital stories, digital exhibits, to try to explain not just the information around that artifact, but also one of the characteristics of digital media beyond its potential for immersion or making you feel like you're in a three-dimensional space is that you can adopt a perspective or a role. So you could play the role of, for example, a tourist and interact with a weaver and find out why this weaving is valued at what it does, what it's worth. And you can make the choice, do I want to go across the way and get a cheaper textile? Or do I now understand what it means to be a conscientious tourist? So digital media provides a way to preserve, a way to build context around the folklore, and a way to allow people to interact with the folklore.
Why is preservation and dissemination important?
I always think of folklore as like, if you look at it worldwide, it's this sort of worldwide compendium of knowledge and wisdom. So if we don't preserve it, if we don't document it, we're losing generations and generations potentially of information, as well as wisdom, insights, solutions to problems. How do you make an effective cast net in order to catch fish? Well, you could ask the Menorcan cast net makers here in Florida. There's an artist who's been doing it for 5 generations. So preserving that information, it could never be recovered in some instances if we don't preserve it. It also creates bridges between generations so that maybe if your grandparents or your ancestors came from somewhere else and you don't actually live there now, you can have a connection with that place and with those traditions through digital media, right? Presenting those traditions in a way to interact with them to you. So it both preserves this really valuable knowledge and skill and wisdom, and it's so important to create bridges for people to be able to remember across generations and remember across spaces.
You recently held an interactive talk at the Orange County Regional History Center focused on myths and legends. What are some popular Central Florida legends?
Yeah, that was really fun. That was a fun event. I was thinking about legends, and like most genres, there are subgenres. So maybe I'll give you like an example of different kinds of legends that we have in Florida. So there are legends about like historical people, right? One would be the story of Jose Gaspar. If you've heard of Gasparilla in Tampa, the pirate parade that happens every year, is related to that legend of this pirate who plundered all of these ships. And in some versions of the story, he's a royal admiral, and some he's a traitor. This is colorful character. That now leads to festivals, right, that we have today. There are also legends that are based on places. So Florida has a number of distinctive places. One I can think about is Spook Hill in Lake Wales, which is what's known as a gravity hill. So it's kind of like an optical illusion. So it's one of those places where you feel like you're walking downhill, but you're actually going up. And so you're like, what is happening here, right? So there's a legend about, I think it was a Native American warrior who fought an alligator, I believe, and died heroically and was buried at the hill. And, so later the European settlers came, and why can't their horses, go up this hill? And so today you can experience that. So something characteristic of legends is something called a legend trip, where you kind of go to the site of a legend or you enact a ritual to kind of make the legend come true, right? So you could go to Spook Hill and see, wow, this is happening, and experience that illusion for yourself. There's also objects, tied to places. So I'm thinking of legends like the Devil's Chair in Cassadaga. So Cassadaga was founded as a spiritualist colony. And so there's a lot of lore about ghosts there, obviously. But one of the legends says that, if you go to a cemetery at midnight, there's a particular chair. It's like kind of a brick chair. If you sit there at midnight, the devil will come, right? So it's a legend you tell, and it's a legend also you can sort of act out if you dare. Halloween is especially effective. And so there are different kinds of legends. There's also urban legends, so legends that are about our contemporary time, and some of the fears that we have. So thinking of like the Oviedo lights, if you've heard of the Oviedo lights, these balls of lights that can come and look like headlights and distract you. So that's one that's sort of an urban legend. It's partially has to do with our experiences on the roads in Central Florida, which is its own nightmare, one might say. And then there are digital legends too. So there's a kind of emerging form called creepypasta, which is you might think of as kind of a crowdsourced legend-like narrative that people co-create in a way. So the famous example of that you may have heard of is the Slenderman legend. There's one I found based in Florida called Willow Lake, which is a story about, it's one of these kind of cryptid stories, but it's actually based on the figure of the banshee from Irish folklore. So a group of people go into the woods, go near camping near Willow Lake, and they're chased by this banshee and terrorized, and they get away with their lives. So legends are attached to places and people, objects, and I could go on for an hour, but I won't.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers?
I would say whenever I talk about folklore, I just like to point out that it's a living entity. So it's something that's rooted in the past, and we perform anew every time in the present, and it gives us kind of a roadmap for the future. So I always like to remind people that folklore is here, right? It's something that is living and that continues to change.
How would someone learn more if they're interested?
I have a great way, which is to join the Florida Folklore Society. So we have a Facebook page on Facebook, Florida Folklore Society. We're actually having an annual meeting in February. And if you go on the Facebook page, we'll update it with the date and everything. But it'll be partially virtual and partially in person at UCF downtown. So we're really looking forward to bringing together folklorists with the people at UCF and all around the state. So please learn about us there and about the Florida Folklife program in Tallahassee that we try to support.
All right, well, thank you so much for being here. I really love those stories. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you're enjoying this show, please subscribe to our channel and follow our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts.